Hello, everybody, and welcome to our reading of the Screwtape Letters. I don't know for sure how many of these we're going to get through today, but we're kind of getting close to the end. We have, let's see, this is letter 27, so we have 27, 28, 5 more to get through. So we'll make it through them all today, but we'll see. Sometimes one letter can take us quite a bit to get through, so we're just going to hit it, and we get as far as we get. That's kind of just the way we do things here. But if you haven't been with me before on these are a series of letters written by C.S. Lewis from the point of view of a demon to his nephew who is trying to cause a Christian to stumble and fall. So it reveals a lot of the techniques and tricks that demons will use, but keep in mind all the terminology and the way that they talk about things are the way that demons think of them, not the way that humans or Christians think of them. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you have thoughts, please go ahead and share them, whether you're live or watching on YouTube. We'll want to have a bit of a discussion here, hopefully go just a bit beyond the common thought process as we go through these. I want to hopefully dig just a little bit deeper and kind of get to that next level with these. So, without any further ado, letter 27. My dear Wormwood, you seem to be doing very little good at present. To use his love to distract his mind from the enemy, God, is of course obvious. But you reveal what poor use you are making of it when you say that the whole question of distraction and the wandering mind has now become one of the chief subjects of his prayers. That means you have largely failed. When this or any other distraction crosses his mind, you ought to encourage him to thrust it away by sheer willpower and try to continue the normal prayer as if nothing had happened. That's a wonderful point. It's such a strange thing. I'm guilty of this. This is something that comes up naturally from the flesh. The idea that whenever we're distracted, when something is bothering us, even when our mind wanders in prayer, that by sheer human focus, we can just force that not to be the case. I don't know where that idea comes from, because it's not... Well, no, I should rephrase that. It comes from the flesh, right? It comes from the fallen aspect of us. We can't accomplish things on our own. And we should know that. That's kind of the whole central point of our coming to Christ and asking him to lead our lives, is because we've tried it on our own and that really didn't do so good. That didn't work so nice. So we need him to do it. And yet whenever it comes to this idea of being pure or changing ourselves, we try to achieve it through this willpower, which is utterly ridiculous. And like I say, I'm not slamming down anybody. I'm just as guilty of this as anybody else. Like, I have ADD, and I try to, sometimes my mind will wander off during prayer, and I try to, focus it, and it's not until many years into my walk I learned, hey, that needs to then enter into the prayer, because that's something that God can kind of help me get a focus on, as opposed to just trying to do it by my own willpower, as if that's accomplished anything good in my life. But it's so easy to fall into. We fall into this weirdness of treating it as if there's two separate things, as if there's the stuff that God cares about, and then there's the everyday. Well, those aren't two separate things. God cares about the everyday. He loves us. He wants to tackle that with us. That's a huge part of his love for us, is that he wants to be with us, even in the small and the ridiculous that come up so regularly. Once he accepts the distraction as his present problem and lays that before the enemy, and makes it the main theme of his prayers and endeavors, then, so far from doing good, you have done harm. Mind you, again, this is speaking from the point of view of the demons, so he's saying that once you make your distraction a focal point of your prayer, that does harm to the demons, because now they can't get at you in that way. Everything, even a sin, which has the total effect of moving him close up to the enemy, makes against us in the long run. Anything, even as a sin, which has the total effect of moving him close up to the enemy, makes against us in the long run. Even a sin, if the result of that sin is that you turn immediately to God and repent of it, is something that will cause demons distress. Now, that's not saying the sin in of itself is a good thing, but your reaction is what we're driving home at here. Your reaction to everything that happens to you is so important, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's something that God likes or not that happens to you, your response to it is your walk. You're not going to be able to change life from just happening to you. You know, none of us have ever managed that. But the way you respond to everything that hits you is so central and so important. A promising line is the following: now that he is in love, a new idea of earthly happiness has arisen in his mind, and hence a new urgency in his purely pecuniary. That's a new word. Pecuniary. There's a reason I just keep a define tab open when I have to read these. As somebody with a pretty decent vocabulary. Means of nature of exposing to a petition such as a formal request or plea. Interesting. Okay, so a petitionary prayer is the prayer of asking for something, as opposed to other forms of prayer like worship. Okay, so it basically just means a prayer in which you're asking for something. I see. And hence a new urgency in his purely asking prayers about this war or other such matters. Now is the time for raising intellectual difficulties about a prayer of that sort. False spirituality is always to be encouraged, on the seemingly pious ground that praise and communication with God is the true prayer. Humans can often be lured into direct disobedience to the enemy, who, in his usual flat, commonplace, uninteresting way, has definitely told them to pray for their daily bread and the recovery of their sick. That is something we have to. I mean, you need to like mentally triple underline and highlight that sentence. You need to pray for your daily needs. Now, yes, you also need to make sure you're giving praise and thanks to God for all you have, all you get, and for everything he does. Absolutely, that's important. That's part of your worship with him, and worship is important. But prayer for the daily is also important, because that means it is he who is providing you everything. The moment you stop praying for it, you start to get into this form of this self-sufficiency that doesn't actually exist. One of the greatest comedies to me is when people talk about this idea of being financially secure, without realizing that that's a ludicrous idea in and of itself, because anything and everything can be so easily removed by one disaster. But we get into this attitude of self-sufficiency. I mean, and this is something that happens, I've talked about it before, but especially in first world countries, you look at our healthcare. When somebody gets sick, I'm not saying don't go to a doctor, but also, yes, pray. And the problem is that the doctors have become our prayer whenever somebody falls sick. And so we have this unreliance on God. And once you fall into that, you no longer have the prayers where you're asking for things from him. Now, you can't let the asking prayers become all you do. Otherwise, you then treat God like he's a genie in a bottle and you rub the lamp when you need him. That's not what it is either. There's a balance to it. You can't fall one way or the other, really. But it's a factor where you can't just... If all you're doing is giving a vague praise to God and you're not actually focusing on your daily walk, he essentially almost becomes like this lofty ideal instead of being a real present and loving father. It's an easy thing to do because you fall into this like line of thinking of, oh, I don't want to bring my petty troubles to him. Well, God cares about those troubles because he cares about you. I love the metaphor of God as Father, because it really tackles so much of the way that we need to be with him. We are his children, and so yes, he cares about our stupid little struggles, even when we think he doesn't. Now that's a different thing than just whining endlessly about them. Now God will still listen to you because he is God, and because he does love you, and because he is all loving. That's also probably one of the bigger difficulties that people have who have, I guess, let's say, troubled childhoods around their parentage. It's difficult to grasp the idea of a parent who does truly love you endlessly, regardlessly. But that is the father that God is. It's also the same way where we are the bride of a perfect and all-loving groom. That's something that's actually kind of hard to grasp because we are flawed, and so we think only in a flawed way. But we're not just children to a father, we are children to the perfect father. We're not just a bride of a groom, we are the bride of the perfect groom. So as much as those are both a calling for us, they are also an understanding that we are loved and covered in a grace. And it's so vital to understand both aspects of that. Because if you just take it as a blanket grace, you're taking that as an acceptance to sin, which is not what that is. But if you're beating yourself up, you're also falling away. You're letting that dark part of your mind cloud you permanently. And that's something the enemy also loves to do. So you really have to you have to keep both aspects of it in constant flow, really. You will, of course, conceal from him the fact that the prayer for daily bread, interpreted in a spiritual sense, is really just as crudely petitionary as it is in any other sense. But since your patient has contracted the terrible habit of obedience, he will probably continue such crude prayers whatever you do. But you can worry him with the haunting suspicion that the practice is absurd and can have no objective result. Don't forget the heads I win, tails you lose argument. If the things he prays for do not happen, then that is one more proof that petitionary prayers don't work. If it does happen, he will of course be able to see some of the physical causes that have led up to it, and therefore it would have happened either way, and thus a granted prayer becomes just as good a proof as a denied one that those prayers were ineffective. That is something that a lot of people fall into. The idea that because God is a God outside of time, that nothing matters. And it could not be further from the case. Yes, he already knows what is going to happen, but that does not make the happening itself meaningless. It's the happening itself is the only reason that there is such a thing as time. If the happening did not matter, then we wouldn't need it. The happening is ultimately important. God already knows what's going to happen because he lives in an existence beyond that dimension that is time. And so for him, the past is the present, which is the future. But that does not make those happenings unimportant. They are the vital aspect of existence right now until the new earth is formed. If none of that mattered, we wouldn't have it. It wouldn't be important. It's vital, all of that happening. And so people also love to do this. We also love this thing where we assume that anything God does has to be beyond physics of understanding, which I've never liked. I've never understood that. That's not to say that God can't work things, which we would define as impossible, but the assumption that anything that God is going to bring about has to be outside of the physics that he's created is kind of goofy to me. I've never understood that. God works through his rules to bring about miracles all the time. Just because you can explain a miracle doesn't mean it's not miraculous. I've never liked that defense that, oh, well, I can explain, why the Red Sea parted or what the Christmas star was, and therefore it's not miraculous. No, not at all. I don't agree with that in the least. Science has come up with an explanation for what the Christmas star likely was. And just briefly to oversimplify it, it's essentially when Saturn and Jupiter overlap in the night sky. They create this exceptionally bright star. This occurrence happens about once, I believe it's every 800 years. And it just so happens that such an overlap occurred in the night sky around the turn of the Common Era, which would be when Jesus was born. The fact that all those things line up, I would still defend as a miracle. That's a lot of coincidences to have line up in the exact right point in time. And that's why whenever people look through all of history and say, well, we can explain this, we can explain this, it's like, okay, even if you could explain everything, that's an awful lot of coincidence. And I would define that as something that's still miraculous. I don't think that science disproves God. If anything, I would argue it almost emphasizes that proof, because if we're thinking about it logically, the fact that something so miraculously unlikely occurs would indicate a miracle. Now, that's not to say I'm necessarily the ultimate authority on that. There likely are miracles that completely defy any sense of physical sense, and that God may have just decided that that's the way things were going to be. I'm not saying that's not the case, but I personally don't think the fact that you could explain a miracle makes it not miraculous. Kind of went off on a side tangent there. We do that here sometimes. It's part of discussion. You, being a spirit, will find it difficult to understand how he gets into this confusion. But you must remember that he takes time for an ultimate reality. We just talked about the number of times I've said something and then 2 sentences later Lewis brings it up is a little bit hilarious to me. He supposes that the enemy, God, like himself, sees some things as present, remembers others as past, and anticipates others as futures. Or even if he believes that the enemy does not see these things that way, in his heart of hearts, he regards this as a peculiarity of the enemy's mode of perception. He doesn't really think, though he would say he did, that things as the enemy sees them, that things as the enemy sees them are things as they are. That's an interesting distinction. We're going to stop and kind of break that down for a second. Screwtape's acquisition here assertion here is we don't actually think that the way God sees things, even if we understand that he exists outside of time, which I just talked about, but we don't understand that even if God exists outside of times, he is the one seeing things as they really are. Subconsciously, in our hearts, we think that the way we perceive things is as they truly must be. And why wouldn't we? We are flesh, we are fallen. Until you learn to have a second sight, you see with fleshly eyes. And so you know the way things are. You're looking at them right now. That's the way the things are. But if you can't look at our world today and realize that your perception on things is not a complete perception, you have to take a second look. So how many times have we received a new bit of information that's completely changed the result of a scenario? I could pull up court case after court case after court case. I could pull up news stories. There are any number of examples of things out there where things have so definitively, undeniably been one way, and then just that little corner turn completely flips the whole thing on its head. And we kind of have this whenever we look at our perception of the world, and we understand that we are seeing things as they truly are, as opposed to realizing that God is the only one who sees everything as it truly is, because he is the one who sees the complete tapestry. I really, really like in the Netflix Daredevil show, there's a quote that all of human existence is a tapestry, and the shame of mortality is that we only get to see it incompletely from the backside. We don't get to see that whole beautiful picture. God sees the picture. And so the insistence that because we're looking at our one thread from the backside that we can see the picture is laughable. But it's only laughable once you understand that that's what it actually is. You can't rely on this earthly perception and say, well, I can clearly see everything because I'm looking at it. Well, you are, but you don't have the sight. You don't have the understanding, and you definitely don't have the context. So I like that Lewis includes that here. That's actually a nice little line. If you try to explain to him that men's prayers today, are one of the innumerable coordinates with which the enemy harmonizes the weather of tomorrow, he would reply, then, that the enemy always knew men were going to make those prayers. And if so, they did not pray freely, but were predestined to do so. And he would add that the weather on a given day can be traced back through its original creation of the matter itself. So that the whole thing, both on the human and material side, is given from the word go. So what Lewis is talking about here is the trap so many people fall into, predestination. And I've had philosophical debates, I've had Christian debates, I've talked about this subject matter a number of times. Predestination and free will are not mutually exclusive. They are, in fact, interlinked indefinitely. The fact is just our free will and where that is ultimately going to lead is already known, but that does not negate the free will, and it certainly doesn't negate the action. The example I like to use of it is that I'm a writer. And my job as a writer is to bring a character through a progression of events so that when they start in place X, they logically move to place Y, and everything that happens to them in the middle is a coherent series of events. And at no point does the character do something where it's something like, whoa, that makes no sense for them to do that. life is kind of the same way. And in that sense, God is a storyteller. Yes, he already knows where we're going to end up. He also knows the series of events that are going to bring us there. But at no point has any of that overridden free will. That's not the way that works. Now, there are times when God may force us into a situation. If you want to think of Jonah and the giant whale as an example of this, sometimes God says, you're going, and you say, nant, and God says, yesn't. But, like, that's not the same thing as negating your free will. Once Jonah went to Nineveh, he still could have refused to preach. God didn't tell him, you have no choice but to deliver this message. That's the thing. It's just the idea that people think that something that's destined to happen means they don't have a choice. It has never made sense to me. That's something that even before I was saved, that was something that just didn't gel well with me. I never understood that argument. What he ought to say, of course, is obvious to us. That the problem of adapting the particular weather to the particular prayers is merely the appearance at 2 points in his temporal mode of perception. Kind of talked about that earlier too, the fact that we see things from this dimension of time, and therefore that's we have this flawed idea that we can actually see things as they are, when in reality we're only seeing them from this warped view, this kind of funhouse mirror perception of the universe, if you want to call it that. And the total problem of adapting the whole spiritual universe to the whole corporeal universe, that creation in its entirety operates at every point of space and time. Or rather, that their kind of consciousness forces, or rather that their kind of consciousness forces them to encounter the whole self-consistent creative acts as a series of successive events. Now, that was a whole lot of sentence there that we should probably stop and talk about. What Lewis is saying here is that our issue is that we get to look at it only from that one appearance, right? As opposed to realizing that we are part of that grand tapestry. And we don't approach everything that happens to us, even the prayers that we make, as a series of events. If you stop and look through everything in your life, you have to realize that just turning something 5 degrees would leave you in such a drastically different place. I've talked before about how if the Earth were off its rotation around the sun by, I believe it's like a foot either way, life would not be able to exist. We would be too cold or too hot for things to exist as they do. That's pretty insane that things are that specifically dialed in. But it's really no different with our walks as human beings. Our walks are so like hairline perfect. Now, in no way does that, again, negate free will. It emphasizes it. But you can't see the grand result of things. You can only see that when you look backwards and see, man, it's insane that all these things turned out exactly as they did. But also there was no other way that they could have gone. Why that creative act leaves room for their free will is the problem of problems. The secret behind the enemy's nonsense about love. How it does so is no problem at all, for the enemy does not foresee humans making their free contributions in a future, but sees them doing so as is unbound now. And obviously, to watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. It may be replied that some meddlesome human writers, notably Balthurus, who is not a writer I am familiar with. That's a new name. Okay, so this was a Roman senator, and historian and philosopher of the Middle Ages. Interesting. I don't know any of his works. I will have to look into that. Maybe we'll do a future study on that at some point. It may be replied that some meddlesome human writers, notably Balthurus, have let this secret out. But in the intellectual climate, which we have at last succeeded in producing throughout Western Europe, you needn't bother about that. Only the learned read old books. And so we have now dealt with the learned that they are of all men the least likely to require wisdom by doing so. We have done this by including, calculating. Oh my gosh. That was, I don't know why my brain just stroked out there and did not want to read that word. We have done this by calculating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks who influenced the ancient writer, and how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, and what phase in a writer's development or in the general history of thoughts it illustrates, and how it affected the later writers, and how often it has been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and whether it is the present state of the question. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate what he said could possibly modify your own thoughts or behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably. Sorry, I'm a 3-year-old and I read the word unutterably and my brain just giggled. This would be unutterably simple-minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race at all the time, it is most important thus to cut every generation off from all the others. For where learning makes free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks be to our Father and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds that history is bunk. Your affectionate Uncle Screwtape. So Lewis kind of delves into a second half of things here, which is the way we approach history. The one thing we don't do, and what we really should do, anytime we're reading something somebody else has written, and as I kind of hit when we first started reading the Screwtape Letters, ironically enough, it's important to take this as something somebody is saying and consider whether or not what they're saying is true. That we really don't do. We take it as just generally this person is taking this sense of knowledge and then we apply it to intellectual debates. We apply it to what's influenced. We apply it to their own lives, what else they may have written, what else they were saying, where things were at in their historical context. But we don't just look at it and say, okay, were they correct? And sometimes it's not as simple as all that, but sometimes it is. And there's even been one or two cases as we've gone through the Screwtape Letters where I have broken apart and said I actually disagree with Lewis on this point. One is in the idea of plucking saved Christians out of the hands of God. I would argue against that. But that's something that's kind of important to do. Now, I'm not necessarily arguing against the academic aspect of all that. I think that is something that's important to do if you're going to try to draw more and more out of it. But never lose the ultimate knowledge that what was written here was written by somebody who was ultimately a man. Now, again, that's different from Scripture. Scripture is something that is godly influenced. And there are specific points, especially in the New Testament, where, the Apostle Paul will say, okay, this is me speaking, this is not God. So when Paul says stuff like that, it's like, okay, so this is actually something that is separate. It is made note that this is not necessarily a godly saying. This is something that Paul's saying. That doesn't make it not true, but it does mean it's something you got to take with the understanding that, okay, this is Paul, not God speaking. Multiple times, and most of everything that's in the Bible is prefaced by, the Lord said, God said this, or this is what we witnessed while we were walking with Jesus. This is our letter to people after we have seen him ascend. That's all Holy Scripture, and that's my answer to people who always love to argue, well, why should I believe the Bible was written by men? Well, so much of it actually isn't. So much of it is them saying, the Lord has said this. But yeah, that's the important aspect of when it comes to writings, is you got to keep in mind, okay, amongst everything else, which again is important, is it true? Whew. Making myself thirsty. All right. Letter 28. My dear Wormwood, when I told you not to fill your letters with the rubbish about the war, I meant, of course, that I did not want to have your rather infertile rhapsodies about the death of men and the destruction of cities. Insofar as the war really concerns the spiritual state of the patient, I naturally want full reports. And on this aspect, you seem singularly obtuse. Thus you tell me with glee that there is reason to anticipate heavy air raids on the town where the creature lives. This is a crying example of something I have complained about already. Your readiness to forget the main point in your immediate enjoyment of human suffering. Do you not know that bombs kill men? Or do you not realize that the patient's death at this moment is precisely what we want to avoid? He has escaped the worldly friends with whom you tried to entangle him. He has fallen in love with a very Christian woman, and is temporarily immune from all your attacks on his chastity, and the various methods of corrupting his spiritual life which we have been trying are so far unsuccessful. At the present moment, as the full impact of the war draws nearer to his nearer and his worldly hopes take on a proportionally lower place of mind, full of his defense work, full of the girl, forced to attend to his neighbors more than he has ever done before, and is likely than he is expected taken out of himself, as the humans say, and daily unconscious dependent on the enemy, he will almost certainly be lost to us if he is killed tonight. That's something that's kind of also a great note to make. And I don't mean to step on any toes when I say this. Once your salvation is sealed, and you are in the correct frame of mind with God, you can't fear death. I don't know why you would at that point. I can understand it can be scary to take that step, but the reality is, once you know where you're going, why you would ever voluntarily want to stay beyond the service that you have to provide for God, I can't fathom that. You have a place waiting for you at the table of Christ. Now, obviously, I say that only hesitantly because I don't want to get the wrong message out. You know, the encouragement of taking your own life, because that's robbing God. That's stealing something that you were given trust of, and stealing from the Lord. So obviously, that's the only reason I put a hesitancy on that. But there was I've actually written a song to this effect too. But there was a man I spoke to once, and I loved his sentence on this. And he was an older gentleman. He's in his 80s, and he said every time he gets sick or has to go see a doctor, people always say, "I'm praying for you to get better," and he liked to joke, "Well, why are you trying to pray me out of heaven?" And so I always liked that he put it that way. And obviously, I'm not saying that we should, again, steal what is God's, what God has given. But the opportunity waiting us in heaven is so grand and so beautiful that you would instead try to hold on to the earthly. It astounds me a little bit. I mean, you've been here for a hot minute, right? You've had a chance to look around. Nothing here is worth holding on to outside of the people that you love. I mean, I've seen everything this world has to offer me. I've seen all the lusts and the pleasures that Satan thrusts upon people. And I look at all of that, and then I look at the opportunity to be with my Father in heaven, and I say that none of that even comes close to being a competition. And that sounds very flowery, but the reality is, look at it. Look at the deals you're being offered here, right? You can try to hold on to everything that is worldly, or you can be with the ultimate loving, benevolent figure where there is no pain and no suffering, and where there is only glorious work and love and praise and worship that awaits. The fact that you would then choose the former astounds me. I mean, I've seen everything this world has to offer me, and it doesn't have a lot. And I don't like it, what I have seen. I love the people, and I want to help the people. And yes, there are moments of joy to be had while we're here. God is gracious enough to allow those to have us, to be that little that source of refreshment that we need. Otherwise, we'd be utterly lost to despair. But I'm not choosing the despair. My choice is already sealed and solidified. as it would be, I hope, for everyone that has been to a church and heard God. Um, those who are lost, those who are in the darkness, they think that it's a silence that comes once you're outside of the earth. So they hold onto the earth with everything they have because that's all they see. But the reality is that there's so much more out there. That the fact that you would then cling to this idea of the earth is a little bit laughable. I'm not meaning that in a mocking way, but it's just like, come on, man. Like, you're seeing the ultimate loving place where a house has been left for you, where you have this signed and sealed table that's awaiting you. And if you've taken the further steps and where you've really kind of gone to that next step of spirituality, there are cities that you're supposed to take care of, lands that you're given under God to watch over. And so the fact that anyone could then look at that and say, well, I want to keep the stuff I have here on earth, that it's a little bit goofy. This is so obvious that sorry, I'm stumbling over my mouth a little bit here. I'm talking too fast. This is so obvious that I am ashamed to write it. I sometimes wonder if you young fiends are not kept out of temptation duty too long at a time. If you are not in some danger of becoming infected by the sentiments and the values of the humans among whom you work. They, of course, do tend to regard death as the prime evil, and survival as the greatest goods. But that is because we have taught them to do so. Do not let us be infected by our own propaganda. I know it seems strange that your chief aim at the moment should be this very thing for which the patient's lover and his mother are praying, namely his bodily safety. But so it is. You should be guarding him like the apple of your eye. If he dies now, you lose him. If he survives the war, there is always hope. The enemy has guarded him from you for the first great wave of temptations. But if only he can be kept alive, you will have time itself for your ally. The long, dull, monotonous years of middle-aged prosperity or middle-aged adversity are excellent campaigning weather, for you see it is hard for these creatures to persevere. I'll put a small caveat here. Again, Lewis seems to be under the impression that it's possible to lose salvation once you have truly come to God, which I don't think it is. The Bible says that no one can be plucked from his hand, and so that's why I would argue against that. Now, that's a different thing than somebody who's claimed salvation but doesn't actually feel it in their heart. That's a total other discussion. But it is absolutely possible that a signed and sealed child can fall back into the worldly ways, which is something that also pleases demons. Not least of all, because then it's something that they can point to all the non-believers and say, look, hey, that Christian, that guy who says that he's got all this love and stuff figured out, he's actually just the same as you. That's one of the greatest thrills they take in a Christian stumbling. But that's what I would argue is one of the dangers of perseverance. It's not that in stumbling, your salvation is put at risk, rather that it gives the demons glee, and you are, still sinning. I'm not belittling it, but I don't think, I guess I would just make sure that that's an understanding I would place alongside this. He's not wrong when he talks about this perseverance, and that's absolutely a very true thing. But if you have truly, utterly said, I am giving my life to God, you can't then take that back. It's not yours anymore at that point. The routine of adversity, the gradual decay of youthful loves and youthful hopes, the quiet despair, hardly felt as pain, of overcoming the chronic temptations with which we have again and again defeated them, the drabness which we create in their lives, and the inarticulate resentment with which we teach them to respond to it. All of this provides admirable opportunities of wearing out a soul by attrition. If, on the other hand, the middle years prove prosperous, our position is even stronger. Prosperity knits a man to the world. If he feels that he is finding his place in it, while really finding its place in him, his increasing reputation, his widening circle of acquaintances, his sense of importance, and the growing pressure of absorbing and agreeable work build up in him a sense of really being at home in the earth, which is just what we want. I talked about that a little bit ago too. You will notice that the young are generally less unwilling to die than the middle-aged and the old. The truth is that the enemy, having oddly destined these mere animals to life in his eternal world, has guarded them pretty effectively from the danger of feeling at home anywhere else. That is why we must often wish for a long life to our patients. 70 years is not a day too much for a difficult task of unraveling their souls from heaven and building up a firm attachment to the earth. Again, I keep in mind my caveat there. I don't know if necessarily if Lewis believes that's possible, but just based on his language, that seems to be the implication. While they are young, we find them always shooting off at a tangent, even if we contrive to keep them ignorant of explicit religion. The incalculable winds of fantasy and music and poetry, the mere face of a girl, the song of a bird, or the sight of the horizon are always blowing our whole structure away. They will not apply themselves steadily to worldly advancement, prudent connections, and the policy of safety first. So inavert is their appetite for heaven, that our best method at this stage of attaching them to earth is to make them believe that earth can be turned into heaven at some future date by politics or eugenics or science or psychology or whatnot. Real worldliness is a work of time, assisted of course by pride, where we teach them to describe the creeping death as a good sense of maturity or experience. Experience, in the particular sense we teach it to give it, is, by the by, a most useful word. A great human philosopher nearly let our secret out when he said that where virtue is concerned, experience is the mother of illusion. But thanks to a change in fashion and, of course, the historical point of view, we have largely rendered his book innocuous. That's interesting. I don't know that quote. What was it? Virtue is concerned, experience is the mother of illusion. Immanuel Kant. Huh. Again, I don't know him, but that is interesting. We will have to look into at some future point if I don't forget. How valuable time is to us may be gauged by the fact that the enemy allows us so little of it. The majority of the human race dies in infancy. Of the survivors, a good many die in youth. It is obvious to him that human birth is important chiefly as the qualification for human death, and death solely as the gate to that other kind of life. I actually love that quote. That is really interesting. Human birth is important chiefly as the qualification for human death, and death solely as the gate to that other kind of life. That is him putting in a rather succinct sentence my ramble earlier. We are allowed to work only on a select minority of the race, for what humans call a normal life is the exception. Apparently he wants some, but only a very few, of the human animals with which he is peopling heaven to have had the experience of resisting us through an earthly life of 60 or 70 years. Well, there is our opportunity. The smaller it is, the better we must use it. Whatever you do, keep your patient as safe as you possibly can. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Yeah, that is something actually. Back in my college days, I wrote a letter on the idea of time affecting temptation. And I likened it particularly to drugs and sex, but it's something that absolutely applies to spiritual temptations, perhaps all the more so, really. Time is one of the greatest enemies of it because time breeds complacency. And rather than seeing all the experience we have had in all that time as an opportunity, we look at it, instead it starts to become this obligation to be fulfilled. And it's very easy to fall into that. I even at a relatively young age, I've fallen into that myself. It's important to understand that ultimately we are here for a very, very short time. Even if we live to be 100, in the grand scope of things, that's a blink of time. And we're here for a job. You know, there's a duty that we're called to while we're on the earth. And so I obviously don't dissuade anyone from having joys and pleasures that are good and godly, but also understand that we're not here for long. We're here for a short amount of time. God is calling us foremostly, to come to him, and then to complete the task he has assigned for us, or tasks as it may be. That's a wonderful thing. And it's something that whenever you look at that, it's hard to then glance at your blink of time that you have and say, well, that's a long time to stick around. Letter 29. My dear Wormwood, now it is certain that the German humans will bombard your patient's town, and that his duties will keep him in the thick of danger. We must consider our policy. Are we to aim at the cowardice or the courage, with constant pride, or at the hatred of the Germans? Well, I'm afraid it is no good trying to make him brave. Our research department has not yet discovered, though success is hourly expected, how to produce any virtue. This is a serious handicap. To be greatly and effectively wicked, a man needs some virtue. What would Attila have been without his courage? Or Shylock have been without self-denial as to the regards of the flesh? But we cannot supply these qualities ourselves. We can only use them as supplied by the enemy. And this means leaving him as a kind of foothold with these men whom otherwise we would have made most securely our own. A very unsatisfactory agreement, but I trust we shall one day learn to do better. Hatred we can manage. The tension of human nerves during noise, danger, and fatigue makes them prone to any violent motion, and it is only a question of guiding the susceptibility into the right channels. If conscience resists, muddle him. Let him say that he feels hatred not on his own behalf, but on that of the women and children, and that a Christian is told to forgive his own, not other people's enemies. In other words, let him consider himself sufficiently identified with the women and children to feel hatred on their behalf, but not sufficiently identified to regard their enemies as his own, and therefore proper objects of forgiveness. But hatred is best combined with fear. Cowardice alone of all vices is purely painful, horrible to anticipate, horrible to feel, horrible to remember. Hatred has its pleasures. It is therefore often by the consumption. Sorry, I read that wrong. It is therefore often by the compensation by which a frightened man reimburses himself for the miseries of fear. The more he fears, the more he will hate, and hatred is a great anodyne for shame. To make a deep wound in his charity, you should therefore defeat first his courage. Now this is a ticklish business. We have made most men proud of most vices, but not of cowardice. Whenever we have almost succeeded in doing so, the enemy prevents a war or an earthquake or some other calamity, and at once courage becomes so obviously lovely and important, even in human eyes, that all our work is undone. And there is still at least one vice of which they feel genuine shame. The danger of inducing cowardice in our patients, therefore, is lest we produce a real self-knowledge and self-loathing, with the consequent repentance and humility. And in fact, in the last war, thousands of humans, by discovering their own cowardice, discovered the whole moral world for the first time. In peace, we can make many of them ignore good and evil entirely. In danger, the issue is forced upon them in a guise to which even we cannot blind them. There is here a cruel dilemma before us. If we promoted justice and charity among men, we would be playing directly into the enemy's hands. But if we guide them to the opposite behavior, this sooner or later produces, for he permits it to produce, a war or a revolution. The undisguisable issue of cowardice or courage awakes thousands of men from moral stupor. This indeed is probably one of the enemy's motives for creating a dangerous world, a world in which moral issues really come to the point. He sees as well as you do that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. which means at the point of highest reality. A chastity or honesty or mercy, which yields to danger, will be chaste or honest or merciful, but only on conditions. Pilate was merciful till it became risky. Whew. Sorry, getting thirsty. I'm trying to drink more water lately. But yeah, Lewis is dead on his point here. Whenever things are easy and good, that's whenever our moral grasp on things tends to completely fall away. It's whenever, the rubber kind of hits the road, if you want to use that phrase, that we actually have to re-examine things. It's one of the kind of silver linings we have around dark despair, and when things are truly horrible, that people that have thus far deluded themselves often can't do it anymore. Probably one of the bigger examples I would use of the recent day is the Charlie Kirk shooting. A lot of people were forced to then sit there and re-examine things and think, wow, that was something that's, and then the response to it is something that's really calling out a lot of stuff for me. Every so often, something horrible will happen that will force people to actually examine things and understand them for what they are. Now, of course, that doesn't make the thing that's happening any better, but it is something that comes out of it that can kind of help guide somebody. That's kind of the effect of living in a sinful world, really. It is therefore possible to lose as much as we gain by making your man a coward. He may learn too much about himself. There is, of course, always the chance, not of chloroforming the shame, but of aggravating it and producing despair. This would be a great triumph. It would show that he had believed in and accepted the enemy's forgiveness of his other sins, only because he himself did not fully feel their sinfulness. That in respect of one vice, which he really understands in its full depth of dishonor, he could not seek nor credit the mercy. But I fear you have already led him too far into the enemy's school. He knows that despair is a greater sin than any of the other sins which provoke it. As to the actual technique of temptations to cowardice, not much need be said. The main point is that precautions have a tendency to increase fear. The precautions publicly enjoined on your patient, however, soon become a matter of routine, and this effect disappears. What you must do is to keep running in his mind, side by side with the conscious intention of doing his duty. Side by side with the conscious intention of doing his duty, the vague idea of all sorts of things he can do or not do inside the framework of his duty, which seem to make him a little safer. Get his mind off the simple rule, I've got to stay here and do so-and-so, into the series of imaginary lifelines. If A happened, though I very much hope it won't, I should do B, and if the worst should come to worst, I could always do C. We talked a little bit about that in an earlier letter, but that exceptional future planning, that almost panic over what may come, what might happen, what may, come about, is something that we're called away from as Christians. We're called to focus on the moment. And the moment and the present are very much a godly look, because you look to a future, I don't know why I'm yawning. You look to a future that ultimately may never come to pass, and then you spend all this energy and this focus and even this spiritual energy on something that is utterly unimportant in the grand scheme of things. We can't see the future, not without godly guidance at any rate. And so you can't spend too much time panicking and worrying about it. Now, that's not to say you can't try to make sure you're set up and take care of yourself as best you can reasonably, but never, ever, ever to the expense of the moment. Superstitions, if not recognized as such, can be awakened. The point is to keep him feeling that he has something other than the enemy and courage the enemy supplies to fall back on, so that what was intended to be a total commitment to duty becomes honeycombed, all through with very little unconscious reservations. By building up a series of imaginative exploits to prevent the worst coming to the worst, You may produce, at that level of his will which he is not aware of, a determination that the worst shall not come to the worst. Then, at the moment of real terror, rush it out into his nerves and muscles, and you may get the fatal act done before he knows what you're about. For remember, the act of cowardice is all that matters. The emotion of fear is in and of itself no sin, and though we enjoy it, does us no good. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Okay then. Letter 30. My dear Wormwood, I sometimes wonder whether you think you have been sent into the world for your own amusement. I gather not from your miserably inadequate report, but also from that in the Infernal Police, that the patient's behavior during the first raid has been at the worst possible. He has been very frightened and thinks himself a great coward and therefore feels no pride. But he has done everything his duty demanded and perhaps a bit more. Against this disaster, all you can produce on the credit side is a burst of ill temper with a dog that tripped him up, some excessive cigarette smoking, and the forgetting of prayer. What is the use of whining to me about your difficulties? If you are proceeding on the enemy's idea of justice and suggesting that your opportunities and attentions should be taken into account, then I am not sure that a charge of heresy does not lie against you. At any rate, you will soon find that the justice of hell is purely realistic and concerned only with result. Bring us back food or be food yourself. I love how Lewis just delves into this. I love to put this idea of Lewis's demons, the way he puts them forth here, against something like the Netflix Devil May Cry series, because this is what demons are. Okay, they are nasty, bitter, utterly evil beings that have nothing in them but consumption and hatred. And weighed against the idea of again, something like, the Rings of Power orcs or the Devil May Cry demons, where it's like, oh, they just love and want to be with their families. No, okay, this is what demons are. And I love that Lewis has hit this so accurately. The only constructive passage in your letter is where you say that you will still expect good results from the patient's fatigue. That is well enough, but it won't fall into your hands. Fatigue can produce extreme gentleness and quiet of mind, even something like vision. If you have often seen men led by it into anger, malice, and impatience, that is because those men have had efficient tempters. The paradoxical thing is that moderate fatigue is a better soil for peevishness than absolute exhaustion. It partially depends on physical causes, but partly on something else. It is not fatigue simply, as such, that produces the anger, but unexpected demands on a man already tired. Whatever men expect, they soon come to think they have a right to, and a dependence of disappointment can, with very little skill on your part, be turned into a sense of injury. We talked about that earlier with the idea that a man's 24 hours belong to him, and therefore something that is called upon to interrupt that time becomes infuriating to us. This comes, again, it's that sense of entitlement and that sense of ownership that we really have no right to that leads to that anger. It is after men have given in to the irredeemable, after they have despaired of relief and ceased to think even a half hour ahead, that the dangers of humbled and gentle wariness begin. To produce the best result from the patient's fatigue, therefore, you must feed him with false hopes. Put into his mind plausible reasons for believing that the air raid will not be repeated. Keep him comforting himself with the thought of how he will enjoy his bed the next night. Exaggerate weariness by making him think it will soon be over, for men usually fear that a strain could have been endured no longer at the very moment when it is ending, or when they think it is ending. In this, as in the problem of cowardice, the thing to avoid is total commitment. Whatever he says, let his inner resolution not be bear whatever comes to him, but to bear it for a reasonable period. and let the reasonable period be shorter than the trial is likely to last. It need not be much shorter. In attacks on patience, chastity, and fortitude, the fun is to make the man yield just when, had he not known it, relief was almost in sight. I do not know whether he is likely to meet the girl under conditions of strain or not, but if he does, make full use of the fact that up to a certain point, fatigue makes women talk more and men talk less. Much secret resentment, even between lovers, can be raised from this. Probably the senses he is now witnessing will not provide material for intellectual attack on his faith. Your previous failures have put that out of your power. But there is a sort of attack on the emotions which can still be tried. It turns on making him feel, when first he sees human remains plastered on a wall, that this is what the world is really like, and all his religion has been a fantasy. You will notice that we have got them completely fogged about the meaning of the word real. They tell each other of some great spiritual experience. All that really happened to you was you heard some music in a lighted building. Here, real means the bare physical facts, separated from the other elements in the experience they actually had. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about a couple letters ago, about that idea of your sight, your experience being what is real, and anything else being merely this nebulous, almost on the wind feeling that wasn't actually true. On the other hand, they will also say, it's all very well discussing the high dive as you sit here in an armchair, but wait until you get up there and see what it's really like. Here, real is being used in the opposite sense to mean not the physical facts, which they are already discussing in the armchairs, but the emotional effort those facts will have on a human conscience. Either application of the word can be defended, but our business is to keep the two going at once so that the emotional value of the word real can now be placed on one side of the account, now on the other as it happens to suit us. The general rule, which we have now pretty well established among them, is that all experiences which can make them happier or better only, if I could use words, that'd be great. The general rule, which we have pretty well established amongst them, is that in all experiences which can make them happier or better, only the physical facts are real, while the spiritual elements are subjective. In all experiences which can discourage or corrupt them, the spiritual elements are the main reality, and to ignore them is to be an escapist. Thus, in birth, the blood and pain are real, and rejoicing a mere subjective point of view. In death, the terror and ugliness reveal what death really means, and the hatred of a hated person is real. In hatred, you see men as they really are. You are disillusioned. But the loveliness of a loved person is merely subjective haze concealing the real core of sexual appetite or economic association. Wars and poverty are really horrible. Peace and plenty are mere physical facts, about which men happen to have certain sentiments. The creatures are always accusing of each other of wanting to eat the cake and have it. But thanks to our labors, they are more often in the predicament of paying for the cake and not eating it. Your patient, properly handled, will have no difficulty in regarding his emotion as the sight of human entrails as a revelation of reality, and his emotion at the sight of happy children and fair weather as mere sentiment. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. That's kind of interesting because we look at things today and there's a lot of argument from things from the objective truth and the feeling of it. And feelings are not irrelevant, far from it. Feelings are something that should inform a desire. Whereas an objective approach needs to come towards things like law and reform, because law and reform are things you can't implement feeling into. Yeah, it's a mistake to completely negate feelings and say that feelings don't matter. But what Lewis is especially tackling here is the idea that we only tend to think that feelings matter on the negative. When feelings are in the positive, it's just, oh, that's just an emotion. Yet when we feel feelings for something negative, oh, well, that's what it really is. And he's absolutely right. Like, the experience is the sum of the parts, right? You can't take any part of that out. I think he's completely correct about that. Whew. All right. Letter 31. My dear, my very dear Wormwood, my puppet, my pygmy. Oh, how mistakenly, now that all is lost, you come whimpering to ask me whether the terms of affection in which I address you meant nothing from the beginning. Far from it. Rest assured, my love for you and your love for me are as like as two peas. I have always desired you as you, pitiable fool, desired me. The difference is that I am the stronger. I think they will give you to me now, or a bit of you. Love you? Why, yes. As dainty a morsel as ever I grew fat on. You have let a soul slip through your fingers. The howl of sharpened famine. For now that loss re-echoes at this moment through all the levels of the kingdom of noise down to the very throne itself. Makes me mad to think of it. How well I know what happened at the instant when they snatched him from you. There was the sudden clearing of his eyes, was there not? As he saw you for the first time, and recognized the part you had in him, and knew that you had it no longer. Just think, and let it be the beginning of your agony, what he felt at that moment. As if a scab had fallen from an old sore, as if he were emerging from a hideous, shell-like tatter, as if he shuffled off for good, and all a wet, shuffled off for good, and all a wet, defiled, clinging garment. By hell, it is misery enough to see them in their mortal days taking off the dirtied and uncomfortable clothes and splashing in half water, and giving little grunts of pleasure stretching their eased limbs. What then of this final stripping, this complete cleansing? The more one thinks about it, the worse it becomes. He got through it so easily. No gradual misgivings, no doctor's sentence, no nursing home, no operating theater, no false hopes of life. Sheer instantaneous liberation. One moment it seemed to be all our world, the scream of bombs, the fall of houses, the stink and taste of high explosives, on the lips and in the lungs, the feet burning with weariness, the heart cold with horrors, the brain reeling, the legs aching. Next moment all this was gone, gone like a bad dream, never again to be of any account. Defeated, outmaneuvered fool! Did you mark how naturally, as if he'd been born for it, the earth-born vermin entered a new life? How all his doubts became, in the twinkling of an eye, ridiculous. I know what the creature was saying to itself. Yes, of course, it's always was like this. All horrors have followed the same course, getting worse and worse by forcing you into a kind of bottleneck, till, at the very moment when you thought you must be crushed, behold, you were out of the narrows and suddenly all was well. The extraction hurt more and more, and then the tooth was out. The dream became a nightmare, and then you woke. You die, and then you are beyond death. How could I have ever doubted it? As he saw you, you also saw them. I know how it was. You reeled back dizzily and blinded, more hurt by them than he had ever been by bombs. The degradation of it. That this thing of earth and slime could ever stand upright and converse with spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Perhaps you had hoped that the awe and strangeness of it would dash his joy. But that is the cursed thing. The gods are strange to mortal eyes, and yet they are not strange. He had no faintest conception till that very hour of how they would look, and even doubted their existence. But when he saw them, he knew that he had always known them, and realized what part each one had played at many an hour in his life, when he had supposed himself alone. So that now he could say to them one by one, not "Who are you?" but "So it was you all the time." All that they were and said at this meeting woke memories. The dim consciousness of friends about him, which haunted his solitudes from infancy, was now at last explained. That central music in every pure experience, which had always evaded memory, was now at last recovered. Recognition, made him free from our company almost before the limbs of his corpse became quiet. Only you were left outside. He not only saw them, he saw him. This animal, this thing begotten in a bed, could look on him. What is the blinding, suffocating fire to you is now cool light to him, is clarity itself, and wears the form of a man. You would like, if you could, to interpret the patient's prostration in presence, his self-abhorrence and utter knowledge of his sins, yes, Wormwood, a clearer knowledge even than yours, on the analogy of your choking and paralyzing sensations when you encounter the deadly air that breathes from the heart of heaven. But it's all nonsense. Pains he may still have to encounter, but they embrace those pains. They would not barter for them for any earthly pleasure. All the delights of sense or heart or intellect with which you could have once tempted him, even the delights of virtue itself, now seem to him in comparison but as half the nauseous attractions of a rattled harlot would seem to a man who hears that his true beloved, whom he has loved all his life and whom he has believed dead, is alive and even now at his door. He is caught up into that world where pain and pleasure take on a transinfinite values, where our arithmetic is dismayed. Once more, the inexplicable meets us. Next to the curse of useless tempters like yourself, the greatest curse upon us is the failure of our intelligence department. If only we could find out what he is really up to. Alas, alas, that knowledge in itself, so hateful and mawkish a thing, should yet to be necessary for power. Sometimes I am almost in despair. All that sustains me is the conviction in our realism, our rejection in the face of all temptations, of all silly nonsense and claptrap, must win in the end. Meanwhile, I have you to settle with. Most truly I sign myself, your increasingly and ravenous affectionate uncle, Screwtape. And so that will close out our reading of the Screwtape Letters. It's been wild to read these and actually see how applicable it is to modern life and everything that's still going on today. Lewis was truly somebody who had a grasp on what he was talking about when he talked about the way the demons attack people. So I think that's something that is marvelous. I hope you guys got something out of it. I hope people that continue to watch in the future will. It's something that really can't be understated how valuable that study can be in your own walk. But that will do it all for this time. Next time, I'm not sure exactly what we'll do yet. We may go back to a study book of the Bible. I may have a couple sermons that I talk about for a while. I haven't fully decided yet. But that will do it for the Screwtape Letters. So I hope you guys had fun with this. I hope you got something out of it. And I will see you all next time.